Introduction of characters and setting. In one of the quieter corners of Queens, New York, lived John Miller and Lisa Anderson, a couple navigating the trials of marriage in their mid-30s. Their life wasn't extraordinary by any means, and to outsiders they might even appear like the modern-day American blueprint of a hard-working suburban couple. Their rented apartment was a small, one-bedroom unit tucked away in an aging building with creaky floorboards and dimly lit hallways. It wasn't much, but it was home, for now. John, a native New Yorker raised in Brooklyn, was the epitome of the blue-collar worker. His days were spent hustling in the fast-paced, often physically taxing construction industry. With his broad shoulders, rough hands, and a tired but determined look eternally etched on his face, he was the type of man who carried more weight than just the tools on his belt. To anyone who knew him, John would come across as a composed and mild-mannered guy, a quiet force of stability. Yet, beneath his stoic exterior was the lingering exhaustion of a man trying desperately to hold everything together, no matter how messy life became. Lisa, on the other hand, was John's polar opposite in many ways. She moved to New York from Chicago 6 years ago, drawn in by the city's limitless energy and the promise of endless opportunities. She had a certain charm, the kind of personality that could light up a room. Lisa enjoyed being at the heart of social circles, moving easily from one social gathering to the next. Her days sometimes drifted by without purpose, as she hopped between hobbies and friend groups in search of something to hold her interest. While John's work ethic had defined his life, Lisa seemed content with a lack of structure. Her days spent scrolling through social media, sipping wine, or gossiping with neighbors about who might be having an affair in the building. It's not that Lisa didn't bring anything to their relationship. When they first met at a mutual friend's party in Manhattan, something about her boundless energy drew John in like moth to flame. Lisa still had that magnetic spark, the one that made strangers feel like close friends within minutes of meeting her. But time had muted their initial chemistry, and increasingly their differences seemed to matter more than their shared history. The place they called home mirrored the state of their marriage in many respects, an apartment that had seen better days but still stood firm, for now. Cracks spiderwebbed across the kitchen tiles, and the fridge hummed so loudly at night that it often competed with their muffled arguments. Piles of unwashed laundry sat in the corner, acting as silent witnesses to Lisa's lax approach to housework, something John never failed to notice after a long, grueling day at work. Still, their environment wasn't all bad. The vibrant culture of Queens often seeped into their lives in small but meaningful ways. The smells of tacos and shawarma from local food trucks wafted through the windows at night, mingling with the laughter of kids playing baseball in Flushing Meadows Park. Occasionally they would go out together, catch a Yankees game or take a walk by the East River, but these moments of bonding were becoming few and far between. What brought these two people together years ago, love and a shared hope for a better future, now seemed more like a distant memory than an everyday reality. The rhythm of the city outside their windows, the energy that Lisa used to adore, only served to highlight how stagnant things had grown between them. And so, the days dragged on. John poured himself into his work, leaving the apartment before the sun rose and often returning long after it set. He convinced himself that the long hours were necessary, that his relentless drive to save money was building a better future for them, but part of him also knew that working late was easier than confronting the slow unraveling happening inside their cramped apartment. Lisa, in turn, convinced herself that John's absence was the root of their problems, justifying her late nights out and growing emotional distance. It was against this backdrop of unspoken resentments and a love that had grown threadbare that their tragic story begins. The unhappy marriage. From the outside. Looking in, John Miller and Lisa Anderson seemed like the quintessential middle-class American couple. But behind the closed doors of their small apartment in Queens, New York, lay a marriage quietly falling apart, one crack at a time. Their relationship, once filled with excitement and laughter, had turned into something far duller, overshadowed by resentment, miscommunication, and unmet expectations. John, the steady and pragmatic one, had always been the rock in their relationship. His life revolved around work, long, physically demanding hours at construction sites where he labored to ensure a future he thought he and Lisa had both dreamed of. Yet, these long hours often left him too tired to engage in anything meaningful at home. By the time he returned to their apartment each evening, it was usually dark. The few moments of rest he tried to steal often began with him collapsing onto the couch and letting out a deep sigh, only to be reminded of how chaotic things had become inside their home. Lisa, however, resented John's distancing. To her, it felt like he chose work over her every single time. What once felt like a partnership began to feel more like a one-sided arrangement. "He just doesn't notice me anymore," she confided to her friend one evening after a few glasses of wine. She felt invisible, undervalued. Lisa didn't work outside the home, but it wasn't for lack of ability. By her own choice, she had relegated herself to what she considered mundane housework, although it must be said that many of her domestic tasks often went unfinished, replaced by wine afternoons or spontaneous meetups with neighbors. She viewed her time as her own, an outlook that John could never fully understand. At first, their differences were endearing, even complimentary. John admired Lisa's vibrancy and her impulsive way of finding joy in fleeting things. Lisa, in turn, respected John's work ethic and admired his reliability. But these differences, while charming at first, had slowly devolved into fault lines. John often secretly judged Lisa's lack of discipline, bristling every time he came home to a messy apartment or found dinner hadn't even been considered, let alone cooked. Meanwhile, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that John saw her as nothing more than a trophy home companion who failed to meet his utilitarian guidelines. "These days it's like I'm just a paycheck to her," John once muttered to a coworker over lunch. "I'm out there busting my ass while she's at home God knows doing what, and do you know what I get for it? A cold apartment and a cold shoulder." When they were together, their conversations often felt like crossing a minefield. Over time it seemed like every sentence sparked another argument, or worse, a tense silence that stretched for hours. Small frustrations compounded. John's leftover coffee mug would sit forgotten in the sink. Lisa would scroll through her phone for hours during dinner. They danced this unhappy tango daily until it became their new normal. Adding fuel to the fire was Lisa's growing desire for stimulation outside of their marriage. While John sought solace in work, Lisa craved connection, excitement, and validation. She began spending more time with neighbors, many of whom were single or divorced women who lived carefree lives filled with late-night outings and unabashed gossip. It wasn't long before John started noticing little things that stung. Lisa was texting more, even during their rare moments together. Once he caught a glimpse of her text screen, and though he couldn't see the words, he could feel in his gut that it wasn't just a friend. Every instance of this built on the last, forming a quiet storm of suspicions and resentments that neither of them was able to address directly. John, the reserved and conflict-avoiding type, dealt with his frustration by withdrawing even further. He threw himself into his work, volunteering for overtime and night shifts under the guise of saving for the future. The truth, however, was simpler. It was easier to stay out than to come home to a situation he could no longer control or understand. Lisa, in turn, told herself she was the victim in all this. "He's never here," she justified to herself on the nights she'd pour another glass of Pinot Grigio and cruise Instagram for hours. To her, John's growing absence wasn't an indicator of the stress he carried. It was proof that he no longer cared. If he cared, she thought, he'd still try. He'd make time. But the real issue wasn't just John working long hours or Lisa slipping further into isolation. The real problem was simpler and crueler. Neither of them knew how to bridge the chasm that had grown between them. And so they didn't. Resentments festered in their silence, turning even the smallest moments into powder kegs of potential arguments. On one particularly raw evening, their frustration reached a fever pitch. Lisa sat on the couch, wine in hand, aimlessly flipping through TV channels while John stood in the doorway, his work boots still on, staring at the mess in the living room, dishes piled high in the sink. Fast food wrappers littered the coffee table. The smell of stale air hung thick. "Lisa," John said flatly, his voice neither angry nor kind, "do you ever plan on cleaning this place up?" The comment hung in the air for a second before Lisa, barely glancing up from her screen, fired back, "Maybe if you're so bothered by it, you should try doing it yourself." That was how so many of their interactions played out, sharp, cutting, and utterly devoid of tenderness. At times it felt like they were more roommates than husband and wife, bound together by circumstance and the sheer inertia of familiarity. Beneath it all, though, was an undeniable truth neither of them could face. Neither John nor Lisa was really happy. Their marriage had become a hollow shell of what it once was. Whether they admitted it out loud or not, there was a palpable sense of loss. Loss of love, loss of mutual respect, loss of hope. They weren't partners anymore. They were adversaries trapped under one roof. As these tensions simmered beneath the surface, neither John nor Lisa could have predicted how quickly everything would spiral out of control. All it would take was one bad night, one misunderstanding, one wrong decision, and the house of cards they had been desperately propping up would come crashing down. Escalating conflicts. The cracks in John and Lisa's marriage didn't appear overnight. They were the product of years of small, unresolved disagreements, simmering resentments, and a growing divide in their priorities. What seemed like harmless quirks in the early days of their relationship, John's workaholic tendencies and Lisa's carefree outlook on life, had long since evolved into sources of deep frustration. For John, it began with the little things. Spilled coffee stains on the countertop, dishes piling up in the sink, and baskets of unwashed laundry gathering dust in every corner of their tiny apartment. These were the sights that greeted him every night after a grueling day on the construction site. He would return home hungry, his muscles aching, and be greeted not by relief or warmth, but by more of the same chaos that he spent all day trying to escape. His patience wore thin, though he rarely vocalized his feelings. Instead, he bottled them up, muttering under his breath as he cleaned up after Lisa and threw together sandwiches for dinner. For Lisa, the frustrations were less concrete but just as sharp. She hated how invisible she felt when John came home and barely acknowledged her presence. Sure, he'd give her a weary nod, maybe grunt a greeting, but his eyes were always distant, preoccupied. It felt like the man she once adored had been replaced by a working machine, one whose sole function was to make money and complain about how tired he was. Lisa had envisioned love as something exciting, filled with spontaneous road trips, lazy Sunday mornings in bed, and laughter over shared glasses of wine. Instead, she found herself tethered to a man who dragged himself to bed most nights without even asking her how her day went. "I'm not a maid, John," Lisa snapped one evening as he dropped his dirty work boots in the middle of the living room floor. "You think I want to spend my day cleaning up after you?" John scoffed, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "It'd be nice if you spent the day doing something useful for once." That was all it took. Another night of bickering ignited, one that eventually gave way to silence so cold it hung in the air for hours. That had become their pattern whenever things got tense, no resolution, just a lingering unease that they were both too proud or too tired to address. Lisa, for her part, felt her own sense of growing entitlement. She often justified her own inaction at home with the argument that John didn't appreciate her anyway. Why should she cook or clean if it was only going to be criticized? She saw John's long hours at work not as a selfless act for their future, but as an excuse, a way to avoid putting effort into their life together. "He works because he wants to, not because he has to," she confided one night to a neighbor over margaritas. "He'd rather be out there pounding nails than spending real time with me." The neighbors often served as Lisa's sounding board, a collection of single moms, retirees, and other stay-at-home wives who shared stories of their own grievances over bottomless glasses of wine. "Maybe if he spent more time at home he wouldn't notice every little thing wrong with it," one of her friends joked, igniting a round of laughter in which Lisa eagerly joined. It was in moments like these, moments John never saw, that Lisa found a sense of belonging she no longer felt in her own marriage. But John had his own confidants too. At work, during brief lunch breaks surrounded by sandwiches and cans of soda, he occasionally vented to his co-workers. "She doesn't even try anymore," he confided to Danny, a carpenter who had been married twice and divorced twice more. "What's the point of coming home if it's to a mess and someone who doesn't care?" Danny's advice was indifferent at best. "Welcome to marriage, buddy. It's all downhill after the honeymoon." Neither John nor Lisa wanted to admit that their problems were becoming unsolvable. The more they ignored the growing pile of unresolved tension, the more it seeped into every corner of their lives. Lisa started going out more, finding herself at local bars or dinner parties where she could laugh and flirt without feeling the weight of John's silent judgment. John, on the other hand, began working even longer hours, volunteering for overtime shifts and double shifts under the pretense of saving money. But really, he was saving himself from the suffocating atmosphere of their apartment. By the time John returned home most nights, Lisa was often zoned out on the couch, flipping half-heartedly through the channels while sipping a glass of wine. Their conversations, if they even had any, were perfunctory at best. "How was work?" Lisa would ask, staring at the TV more than at him. "Same as always," he'd reply, lacking the energy to elaborate. "You?" "Fun," she'd say curtly, offering no details, and that was usually the extent of their interaction. The mutual frustration festered into resentment, each of them blaming the other for the state of their marriage. John, feeling unappreciated, cast himself as the martyr, trudging through exhausting days for a wife who barely seemed to notice. Lisa, meanwhile, saw herself as the victim of neglect, yearning for connection and affection from a man who seemed more interested in his work boots than his wife. The tipping point came subtly, in the form of a series of text messages. John happened to glance over one evening, spotting Lisa's phone light up with a notification. "Michael, can't wait to see you tonight." At first, he said nothing. Maybe it was innocent, maybe it wasn't. Either way, doubt began gnawing at him like a splinter he couldn't shake. Over the following weeks he became more observant, noticing the frequency with which Lisa smiled at her phone or disappeared for hours without explanation. Lisa, for her part, dismissed his silences as nothing more than his usual grumbling. She didn't feel guilty for texting Michael, someone she'd met through a friend at a party. Their conversations felt harmless, even exciting, in a way that her marriage no longer did. "It's just talking," she told herself when a flicker of guilt crossed her mind. "It's not like I'm doing anything wrong." But for John, who sensed there was more to the story, the texts were proof that the chasm between them was no longer just figurative. It was real, widening every day, and neither of them seemed willing or able to pull the other back. And so, the conflicts piled up, each one an unspoken brick in the wall that now stood between them. They were no longer a couple working through hard times. They were something far colder, two strangers pretending not to resent the person they used to love. Signs of infidelity. Lisa's detachment didn't happen overnight. At the beginning of their relationship, she was attentive, loving, and bursting with enthusiasm for their future together. But over the years, as the highs of their honeymoon period faded into monotony, something shifted. Lisa became increasingly distant, and John, though reluctant to admit it even to himself at first, began to notice the subtle but unmistakable warning signs. It started with her phone. Lisa had always been active on social media, posting pictures of her meals, tagging friends at happy hours, or sharing memes about New York traffic. But lately, her attachment to her phone seemed different. She would spend hours scrolling, replying to texts with a faint smile creeping across her face, or turning her screen away the moment John walked into the room. The occasional ding of notifications became a constant chorus, and Lisa's reaction to each one felt personal. One night, as they sat on opposite ends of their worn-out couch, John couldn't help but notice her screen lighting up repeatedly. Lisa's expression shifted subtly, a small chuckle here, a quick bite of her lip there. Curiosity or perhaps suspicion gnawed at John, but he said nothing. He wasn't the type to be confrontational, and a part of him didn't want to hear the answers to the questions that were forming in his mind. "What's so funny?" he asked casually, pretending to focus on the muted game on TV. Lisa barely glanced up. "Oh, nothing, just a group chat," she replied and quickly flipped her phone over so that the screen was hidden. It was a small act, but to John, it spoke volumes. That was when he began to notice her phone usage becoming increasingly secretive. She started taking calls in the bedroom with the door closed, or stepping out onto their tiny balcony under the guise of getting fresh air every time her phone buzzed. The once shared space of their tiny apartment now felt divided into hers and his, as if an invisible wall was going up between them with every notification she received. One evening they were supposed to watch a movie together, a rare attempt at quality time that John had suggested. He had even picked up Lisa's favorite wine from the corner store on his way home. About 10 minutes into the film, Lisa's phone buzzed on the coffee table. She shot him a brief glance, muttered something like, "I'll be right back," and disappeared into the bedroom. John paused the movie, waiting, thinking maybe it was one of her friends or possibly her sister in Chicago. But when 20 minutes passed and Lisa still hadn't returned, he grew restless. John padded quietly to the bedroom door, unsure of what he wanted to hear or not hear. Lisa's voice, light and flirty, filtered through the crack in the door. "Of course, I miss you," she said softly, giggling. "I mean, it's hard to talk when, I have to be careful. He's right in the other room." The words hit John like a sledgehammer. He froze, his hand instinctively tightening on the door frame. He didn't recognize this version of Lisa, the one whose voice sounded so unapologetic, even happy, as she betrayed their 10 years together. John didn't confront her that night. He didn't know how, or even if he should. Instead, he sat up late into the night, nursing a beer at their small kitchen table, replaying her words in his mind. "I have to be careful. He's right in the other room." The statement wasn't just a betrayal. It was a mockery of the life they were supposed to have built together. Over the following weeks, more signs began to surface. Lisa started dressing up more, even when she claimed she was just running errands. Her usual go-to outfit of leggings and an oversized sweatshirt was suddenly replaced with form-fitting dresses and perfectly applied makeup. She began disappearing for extended periods without much of an explanation. "I'm meeting up with a friend," she'd say vaguely, brushing off his questions as though they were intrusive or unfounded. Once John caught a glimpse of her phone as she set it down a little too quickly. A text notification popped up just before she locked the screen. It was a name he didn't recognize. Michael. The preview of the message read, "Can't stop thinking about you." The world around John seemed to warp for a moment. He wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but this was hard to dismiss. Yet, despite the obvious, he found himself clinging to excuses in his mind. Maybe it wasn't what it seemed. Maybe Michael was a friend, and John's insecurities were getting the better of him. After all, Lisa wasn't the type of person to cheat, right? At least she hadn't been. But the pieces weren't adding up. Her constant texting, the way she now monitored her phone like it was a lifeline, the laughter that wasn't directed at him anymore, it was all too much for him to ignore. Then there were the nights Lisa didn't come home at all. "It's girls' night," she'd say on her way out, leaving a swirl of expensive perfume in her wake. But when she returned, well past midnight, her hair slightly disheveled and the faint smell of cologne lingering on her jacket, John didn't believe a word she said. He wanted to confront her, but every time he tried, the words caught in his throat. His pride and fear of losing the last shred of dignity he felt he had left kept holding him back. Instead, he lashed out in other ways, muted sarcasm, passive-aggressive jabs, long periods of silence that filled the already empty apartment with an even heavier tension. Lisa, for her part, didn't seem to care. If anything, the more distant John became, the more it seemed to justify her behavior in her own mind. She told herself that she deserved happiness, excitement, and passion. And if John wasn't going to give her that, then why shouldn't she find it somewhere else? John wasn't stupid. He knew something was happening, even if she wasn't saying it outright. That gnawing feeling in his gut wouldn't let him rest. He started noticing every small thing, the change in her perfume, the way she started humming pop songs he'd never heard of, her disappearing wedding ring that she excused as forgotten, or out for cleaning. Each clue made the tension between them grow thicker and more unbearable. They were a couple living in the same home, but they might as well have been strangers. For John, the unspoken truth hung heavy in the air, a ghostly presence he couldn't ignore but didn't have the strength to confront outright. For Lisa, the thrill of her secret life was intoxicating, a world apart from the drudgery of unhappy domesticity. But as months passed, John began to wonder, how much longer could he keep pretending not to see what was right in front of him? The fateful day, June 14th, 2022, began like any other day for John Miller. He rose before the sun, just as he always did, to start a grueling 12-hour shift at the construction site in Manhattan. The summer heat was merciless, bearing down on his back as he worked, beads of sweat dripping from his forehead despite the bandana tied tight around his head. John took pride in his work, yet lately, he couldn't help but question the point of it all. No matter how much overtime he picked up or how much of his energy he poured into the job, the tension waiting for him at home never seemed to ease. That evening, as John made his way back to his apartment in Queens, exhaustion clung to him like an old, unwelcome friend. The subway ride was crowded, hot, and suffocating, filled with the sounds of strangers' conversations, the hum of a street performer's guitar, and the occasional screech of the train on rusty tracks. He kept his head down, leaning into his fatigue, the simple thought of sitting on his couch, his only solace. All he wanted was peace, even just a sliver of it. But deep down, he knew better than to expect it. When he finally climbed the narrow, creaky staircase to their apartment 3C, he paused for a moment to collect himself before turning the key. Over the years, opening that door had become a kind of psychological battle. John was never quite sure what he'd be walking into. With a stealing breath, he turned the knob and stepped inside. The first thing he noticed was the heat. It was sticky and stale, the faint smell of wine, sweat, and something sour lingering in the air. Lisa had half-heartedly cracked the balcony door, but the humid New York summer breeze did little to dissipate the mugginess in the cramped apartment. There she was, sprawled across the couch in her usual spot, a half-empty bottle of Pinot Grigio on the coffee table and reality TV blaring on the screen. She didn't even look up when he walked in. John dropped his tool bag by the door with a heavy thud, running his fingers through his damp, unruly hair. "Hey," he said, his voice rough from the day and heavy with quiet frustration. Lisa didn't respond. She was scrolling on her phone, her legs tucked under her, her free hand lazily swirling the glass of wine she cradled. The room was a mess. Plastic takeout containers from what looked like Chinese food cluttered the coffee table, crumbs scattered across the rug. The scent of sweet and sour sauce mixed unpleasantly with the stale humidity. A small pile of laundry was still sitting exactly where John had left it that morning, untouched despite his half-hopeful plea for Lisa to fold it while he was gone. "Really, Lisa?" he muttered under his breath, barely masking his annoyance. The words were meant more for himself than her, but even in the silence they carried weight. Finally Lisa looked up, her eyes glassy, the dim light reflecting off the dark circles beneath them. "What?" she said, her tone flat, disinterested, as if daring him to keep going. That single word, so dismissive, set something off in John. He felt his jaw tighten, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. It wasn't just the mess or her indifference, it was the culmination of everything. The long hours he put in, the sacrifices he made, the gnawing loneliness he felt in a marriage that increasingly felt like a partnership in name only. The weight of it all was too much. "You really couldn't even clean up?" he said, his tone sharper now. "I've been busting my ass all day and this is what I come home to?" Lisa shrugged but didn't bother meeting his gaze, her attention already back on her phone. "I wasn't in the mood. Besides, it's not like it's the end of the world, John." "The end of the world?" he echoed, his voice growing louder. "Do you even hear yourself? I'm out there 12 hours a day sweating my ass off just trying to keep this place running, and you can't even be bothered to pick up a damn broom?" She rolled her eyes, an exasperated sigh escaping her lips. "Oh, here we go again," she said dryly. "Poor John, always the martyr. God, you make it sound like you're the only one who's ever worked hard in their life." John stared at her, his face flushed, whether from anger or the heat, even he wasn't sure. He opened his mouth to fire back, but before he could, Lisa's phone buzzed loudly in her hand. She smiled, a bright, fleeting smile, and tilted the screen slightly away from him as she typed a response. "Who's that?" he asked, his voice now low and sharp, the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. "No one," she said too quickly, slipping the phone face down onto the couch beside her. "Just a friend." His heart sank, a familiar weight settling in his chest. He didn't know what hurt more, the lie itself or the casual way she told it. "A friend," he repeated, the two words bitter on his tongue. "Do all your friends make you smile like that?" Lisa gave a short snort of laughter, finally setting the wineglass down. "Jesus, John, you're paranoid. Not everything is some big conspiracy, okay? Maybe you should worry less about my friends and more about why you're so damn miserable all the time." That was it. The dam broke. John's voice rose, filled with years of pent-up frustration. "You think I'm miserable for no reason?" he shouted. "You sit here doing nothing all day, hiding behind your phone, drinking yourself into a stupor, and I'm the problem? God damn it, Lisa, do you even care anymore?" Lisa's laughter turned cold, cutting. "Care? Oh, that's rich coming from the guy who works overtime just to avoid being here," she snapped back. "You want to pretend you're the noble one, but the truth is, you've checked out of this marriage as much as I have." For a moment, neither of them said anything. The room was so silent that the sound of the TV in the background, a reality show about dating on a tropical island, seemed deafening. John's breathing was heavy, and Lisa's eyes burned with tears, whether from anger or guilt he couldn't tell. And then her phone buzzed again. It might as well have been a gunshot. Without thinking, John stepped forward and snatched it off the couch. Lisa jumped to her feet, her tone instantly defensive. "Give it back, John. What the hell are you doing? You have no right." "Who's Michael?" he demanded, holding the phone just out of her reach. The words came out colder than he'd intended, but they were out now, hanging in the suffocating air. Lisa froze, her face shifting for just a second. Fear, guilt, annoyance, it was impossible to tell. "You're crazy," she said finally, her voice trembling as she tried to regain control. "This is ridiculous." But John wasn't buying it, not this time. He stared at the name glowing on the phone screen and felt something inside him begin to crack. He didn't know how this night would end, but he knew one thing for certain. The life they'd once shared, the fragile truce they'd been pretending to uphold, was about to shatter beyond repair. Reaching the breaking point, everything about the night felt heavier, thicker. The air in the apartment, already suffocating in its humid stillness, now carried the sharp charge of unspoken words and escalating emotions. John stood frozen by the couch, Lisa's phone gripped tightly in his hand, his knuckles white with tension. The screen still glowed faintly, the name Michael illuminated like a small, bitter truth he couldn't unsee. Lisa stood a few feet away, her body tense, her eyes darting from John's face to the phone he held. She had crossed her arms defensively, but there was a flicker of panic she couldn't quite mask. It bore through the cracks of her otherwise calculated defiance. This was uncharted territory. They had argued before, even viciously sometimes, but this was different. This was raw, exposed, and dangerously close to irrevocable. "Give it back, John," Lisa demanded, her voice breaking slightly as she reached out a trembling hand. "Oh, we're past that now," John said, his voice trembling with an energy he no longer had control over. There was venom in his tone, but also something deeply fragile. A man who wasn't sure he could stay upright under the weight of what he now knew. His chest rose and fell quickly, each breath sharp, pulling in air that seemed harder to find. "I want you to say it. Just say it, Lisa. I'm not stupid." Her face tightened, the cracks in her composure widening. "Say what? That you're acting insane going through my phone like some psycho? Don't play games with me!" John's voice erupted, loud now, the kind of yell that startled even himself. "You think I don't know? You think I haven't noticed you sneaking off every damn chance you get? Who the hell is Michael?" Lisa flinched but quickly recovered, her defensiveness turning into icy disdain. "God, John, you act like I owe you an explanation for every single thing I do. Maybe if you treated me like a human being instead of some chore you check off after work, we wouldn't even be here." John's mouth opened, ready to fire back, but the words got caught somewhere in the back of his throat. Instead, he looked down at the phone in his hand, his fingers trembling from whatever emotion was roiling inside him. Anger, pain, betrayal, maybe all of it, all at once. "She's deflecting, she's trying to turn this back on me," he thought bitterly, replaying her words. Lisa watched him with a mix of fear and defiance, her arms dropping loosely to her sides as if she wasn't sure whether to scream or cry. Finally, she shattered the silence with a sharp sneer. "Why don't you just admit it, huh? You've been miserable for years, I can feel it, John," she said bitterly, her voice trembling now, no longer cool or composed. Pain seeped through every word, even as she tried to cloak it with anger. "You don't love me! You haven't loved me for a long time, and you know it!" The words cut him deeper than he wanted to admit. Did he still love her? He thought he did. At least he remembered a time when he did. But love wasn't at the forefront of his mind these days. It had been replaced with exhaustion, resentment, and loneliness. God, he was so damn lonely in this marriage. Still, that didn't give her this. A secret life, a betrayal that was now staring him dead in the face. "Don't you dare turn this on me," he said, his voice quieter now but no less dangerous. "Do you know how hard I've worked to keep all of this afloat? For you, for us?" He gestured broadly, his other hand loosening just slightly around the phone. "All I wanted was a little respect, but instead, you're out there, texting him, whoever the hell he is, laughing with him, smiling for him. When was the last time you smiled at me?" Lisa's jaw tightened as her defenses rose back into place. Her eyes narrowed, but tears glistened there, betraying the strong front she was still desperately trying to put on. "You think this is all my fault? Jesus, John, we've both been checked out of this marriage for years. Maybe, just maybe, if you'd noticed me earlier, I wouldn't have had to look elsewhere." Her voice wavered as that final line fell between them like a grenade, ticking loudly in the quiet room. John's hands dropped to his sides, his body slumping slightly as if the fight had just been knocked out of him. The phone slipped from his grip to the arm of the couch with a muted thud. For a brief second he looked at her, really looked at her, this woman he had once loved so fiercely, he'd thought she was his entire world. Now, though, she was more of a stranger, someone he barely recognized. Could he have saved them? Could he have done anything to fix it before it got this far? And then Lisa laughed bitterly, each laugh sharper than the last. It wasn't the kind of laugh that came from humor, but from despair. "You know what? If you can't handle it, John, then why not just make it easy on both of us? Maybe you should file the papers and be done with it, because I am so done with living life like this." John's head snapped up, her words cutting sharper than he thought possible. "Divorce," she'd said as if it was nothing, like erasing a decade of life together could fit neatly into a single word. In that moment, something in him broke. It wasn't clean, like someone shattering a plate. It was messy, jagged, something he couldn't put back together even if he tried. His hands trembled, his breath quickened, and his heart slammed hard against his ribcage. Everything, the long hours at work, the endless nights alone, the silent disconnection that had eaten away at both of them, it all came surging out in a tidal wave of frustration and anger. Without thinking, John slammed his fist down on the coffee table. The wooden surface cracked ever so slightly under the force, rattling the half-empty wine glass which tipped and spilled red liquid across the apartment's threadbare rug. Lisa jumped back instinctively, her face a mix of shock and fear. "Don't think for 1 second," John growled, his voice trembling, That I'm just going to roll over and let you walk away like none of this matters. Like we never mattered. Lisa's face hardened at his words. She crossed her arms again, but this time it wasn't out of defiance. It was a shield, something to barricade herself from the intensity radiating from John. "You're scaring me, John," she said, quieter now, her voice less filled with venom. "You don't even sound like yourself." He stepped back, his eyes darting around the room, his chest still heaving. Maybe she was right, maybe he wasn't himself. The man he felt like in that moment was someone he didn't want to recognize, someone standing precariously close to the edge. The only question left: what would happen when he pushed too far? Acting in the heat of the moment. In that stifling, suffocating apartment, John felt something snap inside him. The room seemed to tilt for a brief moment, his vision narrowing as the anger bubbling beneath the surface finally boiled over. Years of frustration, resentment, and heartbreak, all bottled up, erupted in an instant, and suddenly, he was no longer entirely in control of himself. Lisa stood across from him, her arms crossed, her gaze sharp but nervous, like someone watching a loaded gun, not sure if it was even pointed in their direction. The spilled wine on the carpet, the cracked coffee table, the glowing phone with Michael's name, it all painted a picture John couldn't unsee. In this moment, it was as if everything Lisa had said, everything she represented, became a singular, blinding representation of betrayal. He couldn't reason with it, he couldn't process it, he could only feel the weight of it crushing him. "I've given you everything," John growled, his voice barely above a whisper but laced with raw intensity. "And for what? This?" Lisa flinched, but her defensive posture didn't soften. Her voice was cold, clipped. "Don't you dare act like you're some sort of martyr, John. You think being here with you has been some kind of prize? You're never here, and when you are, you make me feel like I'm nothing but an obligation." Her words hit him like slaps to the face, fueling the fire already raging inside of him. "I bust my ass every single day for you!" John bellowed, his fist colliding with the side of the wall this time. A faint dent appeared in the drywall, but that didn't faze him. His chest continued to heave as his hands trembled with unrestrained energy. He wasn't thinking anymore. He was purely reacting, moving on instinct. "And in return you humiliate me? You lie to me? You cheat?" Lisa's glare faltered for just a moment, but her pride wouldn't let her crumble. "Stop pretending I'm the only one at fault here," she shot back, her voice trembling but defiant. "You checked out of this damn marriage years ago, John. You put your job, your stupid construction jobs, above everything, including me. So yeah, maybe I finally decided I didn't want to feel invisible anymore. Can you blame me?" Her words twisted in John's head into a confirmation of his worst fears. "You didn't want to feel invisible, huh?" he spat bitterly. "Well, congratulations, Lisa. You're the center of this shit show now." Instinctively, John grabbed the half-empty bottle of wine from the coffee table, his hand tightening around its neck as he paced to the center of the room. The movement startled Lisa just enough for her to step back, her confidence briefly crumbling into visible unease. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice uncertain but edged with authority. "John, stop! You've made your point." But John didn't stop. His mind was too clouded, his judgment too far gone. He needed her to feel, even for 1 second, the destructive chaos that was tearing him apart inside. Without thinking, he slammed the bottle against the edge of the table, causing shards of glass to fall to the floor and a thin puddle of wine to spill across the battered rug. Lisa gasped audibly, her eyes wide with both shock and anger. "What the hell is wrong with you? Are you insane?" "Maybe I am!" John roared, his voice trembling, only half aware of what he was saying anymore. He reached into his pocket, searching for his lighter, a habit ingrained in him from the occasional cigarette after a rough day. The silver Zippo felt cold in his hand as he held it up, his fingers flicking it open almost absent-mindedly. "John, stop it!" Lisa screamed, panicking now as she realized the gravity of what was unfolding. She instinctively moved toward him, her hand outstretched, but John quickly took a step back. His fiery expression dared her to come closer. "You wanted destruction, right, Lisa? You wanted freedom from this oh-so-terrible nightmare of a life with me? Let's burn it all down, huh? Let's end it!" As his thumb sparked the lighter, a small flame danced to life in his hand. Lisa froze, her expression shifting into something caught between rage and utter terror. "Put it down, John. You don't know what the hell you're doing," she pleaded, her voice breaking now as panic fully set in. But John didn't feel like himself anymore. He felt like someone watching his own life unfold in slow motion, unable to stop it. In a single, reckless moment of rage-fueled thoughtlessness, he dropped the lighter directly onto the damp, wine-soaked corner of the rug. The flame caught instantly, spreading with an alarming speed that neither of them had anticipated. Within seconds, the edges of the carpet were engulfed in unruly orange flames. The heat and thick, acrid smell caused both of them to stagger back. The flames licked at the coffee table's splintered wood and shot upward, their glow casting shadows that danced eerily against the walls. "Oh my God!" Lisa screamed, her voice raw as the fire began to spread toward the couch. She shoved past John, stumbling toward the balcony door in a desperate attempt to escape the rapidly growing blaze. "What the hell have you done?" John's heart raced as the severity of the situation finally penetrated the haze in his mind. His anger dissolved instantly, replaced by pure adrenaline and terror. The flames were spreading faster than he could comprehend, climbing the threadbare curtains, consuming everything in their path. "Lisa!" he shouted, his voice cracking as his body surged forward. He could barely see her through the thick smoke that was already filling the room. "We have to get out, now!" Lisa's only response was a panicked coughing fit as the fumes overwhelmed her. She fumbled near the balcony door, trying to reach for the latch, but the growing inferno seemed to close in on her from all sides. John darted toward her, ignoring the searing heat against his skin as black smoke choked his lungs. "I got you!" he shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the apartment's front door. But as they moved, Lisa stumbled, her body weak and unsteady from the lack of breathable air. "Get out!" she wheezed, her voice barely audible through the chaos. "John, just go!" "No!" John shouted back, refusing to let go. He wrapped his arms around her, dragging her limp body toward the exit. The walls groaned as the fire crept higher, and the air was filled with shattering glass and the deafening roar of destruction. By the time John reached the front door, smoke and flames seemed to engulf everything behind him. The unbearable heat stung his eyes and his skin felt like it was on fire. Still, he pushed forward, desperate to save both of them from the nightmare that had unfolded in mere minutes. But no matter how far he dragged her, John couldn't shake the bitter realization that this uncontrollable chaos, was the culmination of all their unresolved pain, all their bottled-up bitterness, all the bridges they had burned between each other long before the fire ever ignited. And in those fleeting moments as the apartment turned to ash around them, he couldn't help but wonder, had this always been where they were destined to end up? The devastating aftermath. The flames consumed everything far faster than John or Lisa could have anticipated. By the time the fire department arrived, the once cramped, messy apartment was nothing more than a smoking, charred skeleton. The sirens that screamed through the humid Queen's evening had brought small crowds of onlookers, neighbors standing in clusters on the street below, whispering to one another as firefighters doused what was left of the blaze. John and Lisa's neighbors could only watch in panicked curiosity as officials moved with frantic purpose. Fire hoses vomited torrents of water onto the choking, angry flames, extinguishing pockets of fire that licked hungrily at shattered balcony railings and scorched window frames. The acrid scent of burning plastic and singed drywall lingered in the air, mixing with the humid stink of summer in the city. John had managed to pull Lisa out of the building moments before the apartment was completely engulfed in flames. His arm wrapped tightly around her waist, pulling her through the dense black smoke as she struggled to stay conscious. Coughing violently, his vision blurred by the heat and debris, he collapsed just yards from their apartment's burning threshold. Lisa, limp in his arms, was barely breathing. Paramedics rushed them onto stretchers, oxygen masks pressed firmly against their faces as EMTs worked to stabilize them. Lisa's condition was far worse. The smoke had overwhelmed her delicate frame faster than it had John's. Her breaths were shallow, her skin pale. As firefighters worked tirelessly behind them to control the spreading fire, John's gaze remained fixed on Lisa as they were loaded into different ambulances. The flashing red and blue lights strobed chaotically in the night, echoing the panic pounding in John's chest. Later that night, John sat slumped in a stiff plastic chair at the emergency room, barely able to process what had happened. His hands shook as he stared at them, his palms tinged faintly pink from minor burns but otherwise unscathed. The exhaustion settled into his bones, but no amount of pounding fatigue could distract him from the weight bearing down on his chest, the knowledge of what his actions had unleashed. A doctor eventually approached him, clipboard in hand, but her expression was solemn. She sat down beside him, her voice measured yet emotional as she delivered the news. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her words slicing through him like a blade. "We did everything we could, but the smoke inhalation had already caused a significant amount of damage. She didn't make it." John's body tightened as the words echoed in his ears. He didn't say anything, couldn't say anything. His mind wouldn't allow him to process it. Lisa, his Lisa, the woman who infuriated, delighted, and mystified him, was gone. Not because of illness or accident, but because of him. His foolish actions, born out of anger and recklessness, had escalated into destruction far beyond anything he could have imagined. The days after the fire passed in a surreal haze. News of the tragedy spread quickly, the details reaching the ears of everyone in the neighborhood, and then rippling outward. The media painted bleak portraits of what had happened, with headlines like, "Queens couple's apartment fire turns deadly after domestic dispute," or "Tragic death linked to suspected arson in New York suburb." For John, the world became a prison, both figurative and literal. Interrogations came first. Police officers sat across from him in cold, gray-walled rooms asking the same questions over and over. How did the fire start? Did you intend to harm your wife? Why didn't you call for help the moment the flames began? John had no answers, at least none that could bring Lisa back. He mumbled through his explanations, reliving every agonizing detail. He could barely recall being arrested, the cold steel of handcuffs biting into his wrists as he was escorted from the hospital to the police station. Every motion, every moment felt like watching himself in a dream where escape and redemption were impossible. Lisa's death sent shockwaves through their small circle of friends and acquaintances. To some, the tragic end felt inevitable, a brewing storm that had finally erupted. Lisa's sister, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had never trusted John, used her grief as fuel for her rage. In interviews with investigators, she painted him as a possessive, volatile man who had driven Lisa into despair. She was trying to leave him, Lisa's sister claimed during one meeting with detectives. He's always been unstable, he wanted to control her, and in the end, he destroyed her. Whether that narrative was entirely true didn't matter to the court of public opinion. To neighbors and co-workers who only knew fragments of John and Lisa's story, the tragedy painted him as the villain. Despite his own guilt, John sat silently through weeks of legal proceedings. His lawyer argued for leniency, depicting him as a good man who had made a terrible, impulsive mistake, but the prosecution wasn't sympathetic. To them, John wasn't just a man overcome by anger, he was a danger to society, someone who had allowed his unchecked emotions to escalate into an unforgivable act. The court focused on a single question: was it manslaughter or murder? Did John intend to kill Lisa when he dropped that lighter, or did he simply act in a moment of rage without considering the horrific consequences? In the end, the jury found him guilty of manslaughter. John was sentenced to 25 years in prison, though to him, it felt like far less than he deserved. Lisa's memory, the sharpness of her voice, the way her laugh had once lit up an entire room, even her infuriating habits, haunted him constantly in his cell. The other inmates ignored him, but that suited John just fine. How could someone else's judgment make him feel worse than the guilt that already consumed him? The fire had taken more than just Lisa's life. It had destroyed everything John had once known, leaving him to sift through the ashes of regret and tragedy. For years to come, he would replay that moment over and over, questioning if there was ever a path where love could have prevailed or if their story had always been doomed to end in flames. The investigation. The smoldering remains of Apartment 3C were still warm when the investigation officially began. The air around the charred building in Queens was thick, not just with the acrid smell of burnt wood and plastic, but also with the weight of unspoken questions. As dawn broke over a shaken neighborhood, the once bustling street was eerily quiet, marked only by the occasional murmur of firefighters and police officers cordoning off the scene. Detective Mark Brennan, a seasoned investigator with 20 years of experience under his belt, arrived on site just as the fire crew was packing up their hoses. Brennan was tall and lean, with piercing blue eyes and a demeanor that demanded attention without words. This wasn't his first house fire, but something about this one already felt off. The way people were talking, the urgency from the first responders, it all pointed to something darker than a tragic accident. "All right, what are we dealing with?" Brennan asked sharply as he approached one of the officers standing by the yellow tape. Officer Ramirez, a younger cop with a nervous energy, glanced at his notepad before responding. "Victim inside, Lisa Anderson, 34, pronounced dead on scene. Husband, John Miller, made it out alive. EMTs said he dragged her partway out, but she didn't make it. Fire might have started in the living room. Neighbors said they heard shouting and... well, it doesn't look like an accident." "What kind of shouting?" Brennan asked, narrowing his eyes. They said it sounded like an argument. One of them said the husband was shouting loud enough that they could hear, cheating through the walls, Ramirez explained, his tone hesitant. We took him to the precinct after the medics patched him up. He's, not doing well, kept muttering weird stuff, smells like he'd been drinking. Brennan absorbed the information silently, his eyes scanning the charred building. He already knew the case would hinge on two critical questions. Was the fire intentional, and what role had John Miller played in it? Stripping the emotional weight of tragedy away was part of his job, but even now, he couldn't help but feel the pull of the human side of the case. A man's wife was dead, but was he a grieving husband, or the perpetrator of a crime? The scene of the fire. The apartment itself was a haunting sight. Small and suffocating even before the fire, it now looked like a burnt-out war zone. The living room bore the unmistakable marks of devastation. The couch was a smoldering frame, its fabric reduced to ash. The coffee table had collapsed under the weight of the flames, its remains scattered beneath the darkened windows. On the floor, shards of green-tinted glass, likely from a broken wine bottle, glinted faintly amidst the debris. Brennan crouched by the remnants of what had been the living room rug, now blackened and charred. The fire hadn't just burned fast, it had burned fiercely, consuming everything in its path. As he looked closer, his sharp eyes caught something that made him pause. A distinct circular burn pattern near the rug's edge, darkened more deeply than the surrounding area. He gestured toward the fire investigator taking photos nearby. "What do you make of this?" Brennan asked, motioning toward the pattern. The investigator, a stout man named Carl with soot streaked across his face, stepped forward and squatted next to Brennan. Looks like it could have started here. Based on the burn pattern, I'd say something flammable was poured or spilled. Maybe accelerant or alcohol. See how the charring fans outward from this point?" Brennan nodded grimly. His instincts had been correct. This wasn't just a tragic fire, it was deliberate or at least carelessly triggered. "And the lighter?" Brennan asked, standing upright. Carl shook his head and pointed toward the evidence bag containing a silver Zippo. "Found it over by the far wall. Doesn't prove much, but it definitely raises questions." As questions grew, so did the grim reality of what may have led to the fire. Brennan ordered the team to bag every potential piece of evidence: the shards of broken glass, the melted remnants of furniture, and the lighter. Everything had to be pieced together to tell the story of what really happened that night. Interviewing the neighbors. As the forensic team worked the scene, Brennan turned to the neighbors, those who had gathered on the sidewalk hours ago, whispering over cups of coffee and shaking their heads. They looked frightened, confused, and strangely ready to talk. The first, Mrs. Patel from apartment 3D, was wringing her hands as Brennan approached her. She was an older woman with kind eyes, but her voice faltered as she spoke. I heard yelling, Detective. It wasn't the first time," she said, shaking her head sadly. "They were always shouting. Not every night, you understand, but often enough. Last night was the worst. It sounded violent." "Violent how?" Brennan pressed. She hesitated, glancing around as though unsure she should be speaking at all. "He said something about cheating. I think Lisa may have said something to provoke him. Whatever it was, his voice, it scared me." Further interviews painted a clear picture of the relationship between Lisa and John. One neighbor described hearing the wine bottle breaking. Another mentioned hearing heavy banging, likely John hitting the table or wall in frustration. These weren't small arguments. They were heated, explosive. But none of them provided direct evidence that John had set the fire. It was all circumstantial, a puzzle missing its key pieces. Confronting John Miller. When Brennan finally entered the dingy interrogation room where John Miller sat slumped over the steel table, he was prepared for resistance. But John didn't even look up as Brennan walked in. His eyes were bloodshot, his face pale, his hands trembling faintly. If a broken man had a face, it was this. "So, John," Brennan began, his voice steady but laced with authority, "you want to tell me what happened last night?" John's eyes flickered toward Brennan for a moment before dropping back to the table. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," he muttered. His voice was hoarse, low, not from a conscious effort, but from the weight of exhaustion and regret. I didn't mean for it to. I just wanted her to stop." "Stop what, John?" Brennan pressed, leaning slightly closer. John squeezed his eyes shut, his shoulders shaking. "The yelling, the way she looked at me, like I was nothing. I just wanted her to. God, I don't even know. I was so angry. I grabbed the lighter and I swear, I didn't think it would go that far." "What about the wine?" Brennan asked calmly, his voice masking the growing tension. "Were you drinking? Was Lisa?" John's head sank lower into his hands, his voice faltering. She had some. I had some. It just happened. I didn't mean to hurt her. I swear, Detective, I loved her. Did you start the fire? Brennan's voice grew sharper, taking advantage of the rawness in John's tone. Silence. John couldn't or wouldn't answer. His guilt was written in every twitch of his hands and every tear that streaked down his soot-streaked face. The turning point. In the days that followed, the investigation revealed damning evidence. The broken wine bottle was confirmed to have been ignited by John's lighter, and testing showed traces of alcohol spread across the charred rug fibers. The scene told a story of impulse, rage, and regret, one that prosecutors would later argue was fueled by jealousy and a toxic relationship spiraling out of control. As the investigation concluded, Detective Brennan couldn't shake the image of John sitting in that interrogation room, broken beyond repair. While the evidence against him painted a clear picture, Brennan knew that the flames consuming apartment 3C had destroyed far more than furniture and walls. They had consumed 2 lives, Lisa's and the fractured remnants of the man John had once been. Evidence reveals the truth. The air in the police evidence lab was cold and sterile, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glare on the forensic evidence collected from apartment 3C. Detective Mark Brennan stood in the doorway, his arms crossed tightly over his chest as he watched the forensic team process the remains of a night that had spiraled out of control. The truth, he believed, was buried in the ashes, waiting to be pieced together. "All right, what do we have so far?" Brennan asked, his voice sharp but calm as he stepped forward toward the lab table. Maggie Lopez, the lead forensic technician, glanced up from her workstation. She was meticulous and unflappable, a veteran in her field, and her confidence never failed to impress Brennan. "We've been working through the items recovered from the scene," she said, gesturing to a tray filled with charred remains. "There's something you're going to want to see." Brennan leaned closer as Maggie picked up a sealed evidence bag containing the shattered pieces of a green wine bottle. Despite being partially melted and blackened by the fire, the bottle's distinctive neck was intact, its label only faintly legible. Brennan recognized it immediately. "This was Lisa's, right?" Brennan asked, though he already knew the answer. Forensic photos of the apartment had shown the bottle toppled on the floor by the couch, crimson wine pooling and seeping into the rug before it had been consumed by the flames. "Yeah," Maggie confirmed, holding the evidence bag up to the light. "We're analyzing the liquid residue inside. Preliminary tests show it's standard red wine, but—" She paused and raised her eyebrows at Brennan, a look that signaled something significant. "There's also faint traces of accelerant, probably the alcohol in the wine. We think this is where the fire started." "Lisa's wine," Brennan murmured under his breath, his mind working rapidly to piece the details together. The night of the argument replayed in his head, the burning rug, the lighter, John's confession about grabbing the bottle in a moment of rage. It was starting to fall into place, but he needed more. "What else?" Brennan pressed. "There's got to be more here." Maggie set the wine bottle aside and picked up another evidence bag that contained a silver Zippo lighter, its gleaming surface now dulled by a thin layer of soot. "Here's your second smoking gun. This lighter was found on the far side of the living room, partially melted, but the markings matched the description of the lighter John Miller was carrying during the incident. His prints are all over it." Brennan's jaw tightened as he stared at the lighter. "So, the fire starts near the rug, close to the wine spill, and the lighter is across the room. Could the fire have been intentional?" Maggie's expression was unreadable. "That's one interpretation," she said carefully. "But given how quickly the fire spread, it could have also been carelessness. If alcohol soaked into the rug and someone dropped this lighter, it wouldn't take much for the flames to spread out of control. The fire had plenty of fuel." Brennan sighed deeply, his mind caught in the delicate dance between negligence and intent. "Was it rage or was it recklessness?" he muttered to himself. "What about the circular burn patterns you found on the rug? What do they tell us?" Maggie nodded toward the microscope on the table. "That's the real kicker, Detective. The charring pattern on the rug is uniquely intense, almost like a splash pattern. We ran further tests and the results show that wine was poured or spilled deliberately. It wasn't a random accident, Mark. Someone intentionally dumped liquid there right before the fire started." That statement hung in the cool air like a noose tightening around John Miller's neck. The autopsy report. Brennan's phone buzzed in his pocket as Maggie continued explaining the evidence. With a quick glance, he saw a text from the medical examiner's office. "Autopsy results are in. Come down ASAP. A pit formed in his stomach as he made his way to the coroner's office. Lisa Anderson's death was at the center of this case, and for all the evidence the forensic team had collected, the truth about her final moments lay with the examiner. Dr. Scott Chang greeted Brennan with a clipboard in hand, his face somber. "Detective," he said by way of greeting, "you're going to want to sit down for this." "No need," Brennan replied curtly, his nerves already frayed. "Just tell me, what did you find?" "One key detail changes the game," Dr. Chang began, scanning his notes. "Lisa didn't die from burns or the fire. Cause of death was smoke inhalation. However," he adjusted his glasses and locked eyes with Brennan. "Based on her blood work, Lisa was unconscious before the fire consumed the apartment." "Unconscious?" The word hit Brennan like a hammer. "How? Was there trauma? Was she drugged?" "No evidence of physical trauma like blows to the head or restraints, and no drugs in her system aside from alcohol," Dr. Chang explained. "But her blood alcohol concentration was high, 0.18%. That's enough to impair motor functions and in some cases cause lightheadedness or passing out, especially if combined with stress or a lack of food. She was drunk," Brennan concluded, his mind racing. "Too drunk to escape once the fire started, and John dragged her part way out, but it was already too late." "Exactly," Chang confirmed. "The smoke was overwhelming by then. She was overcome before she could regain consciousness." Brennan leaned on the nearest countertop, his teeth grinding as anger and frustration coursed through him. The details were lining up, each one making it clearer that Lisa's death may not have been premeditated. But it wasn't an accident either. It was negligence. It was rage. It was a cocktail of impulse and carelessness that brewed into tragedy, replaying the night's events. With all the pieces laid out before him, Brennan reconstructed the events of that fateful night. John and Lisa had been arguing, neighbors confirmed that much. John described grabbing the wine bottle in anger, and Maggie's tests verified the wine soaked into the rug. Fueled by alcohol and suppressed rage, John's decision to flick open the lighter near the spill, whether intentional or reckless, sparked a fire that ballooned out of control. Lisa, impaired by alcohol and overwhelmed by the smoke, never stood a chance. By the time John realized what he'd done, his desperation to fix his actions was too late. Dragging her through the inferno had cost precious seconds, and Lisa's unconsciousness sealed her fate. Brennan stared down at the lighter in the evidence bag one final time. The truth was laid bare. This fire hadn't been the result of a malicious plan to kill. It had been a rage-fueled mistake, but one with deadly, irreversible consequences. The final blow. Back at the station, Brennan sat across from John Miller in an interrogation room one last time. John looked hollow, gaunt in a way that couldn't just be blamed on the night he'd spent in the hospital for minor burns and smoke inhalation. "John," Brennan began, locking eyes with the man who had caused so much pain, "the evidence is clear. You didn't mean to kill Lisa, but your actions that night, reckless, angry, created the perfect storm for this tragedy. The spilled wine, the dropped lighter, her inability to escape, you set it all in motion." John slumped forward, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders shook, and a muffled sob filled the room. "She didn't deserve this," he choked out. "I loved her. I didn't want this to happen. I didn't." Brennan leaned back, his expression resigned. "You might have loved her, John, but that night you let your anger control you, and now you have to live with the consequences." The evidence, like the fire, had revealed everything and burned away any hope John might have had of absolution. The trial. It was a cold October morning when John Miller was escorted into the courtroom for the first day of his trial. As he walked through the narrow wooden doors, shackled at the wrists, every eye in the room turned toward him. The brass fixtures of the courtroom reflected the bright fluorescent lights while the room buzzed with quiet murmurs. News of the fire that had engulfed Apartment 3C, and more significantly, the tragic death of Lisa Anderson, had spread far and wide. This trial, people whispered, wasn't just about determining John's guilt, it was about understanding how a marriage could burn up so catastrophically, both literally and figuratively. The prosecution painted him as a volatile man driven by anger and jealousy, while the defense argued that John's actions had been nothing more than a reckless, tragic mistake. The stakes were high. A guilty verdict could mean life in prison if the jury believed John had intentionally started the fire with malice. On the surface, it was a classic courtroom duel. But beneath, it was something messier. A deep, emotionally charged attempt to dissect a doomed marriage in front of 12 strangers tasked with determining John Miller's future. Day 1, the prosecution's opening argument. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," began Assistant District Attorney Marianne Langston, her voice smooth, forceful, and purposefully measured, "this case is about two people and the anger that consumed one of them." Langston, a veteran prosecutor with an impeccable conviction record, walked slowly across the courtroom, letting her words hang in the air. Her dark suit was immaculate, and every movement she made exuded confidence. "On the night of June 14th, she continued, "John Miller and Lisa Anderson stood on the edge of a toxic, crumbling marriage. Fueled by alcohol, jealousy, and rage, John made the decision that ended Lisa's life. This was not an accident. Evidence will show that John poured wine onto that rug. Evidence will show that John flicked open that lighter, knowing full well the destruction that fire could bring." Her voice rose slightly, driving the next point home. "We're not here to speculate. We're here to establish the truth. And the truth is that the fire John Miller started wasn't just reckless, it was criminal." As Langston concluded her opening statement, she turned directly to the jury. "Lisa Anderson paid the ultimate price for her husband's anger. We ask you to hold him accountable." John sat motionless throughout her speech, his head hanging low. His lawyer, Marcus Bright, rested a hand on his arm in silent reassurance. The room was electric with tension. The jury, a carefully selected mix of professionals, retirees, and blue-collar workers, shifted slightly in their seats, their expressions ranging from somber to skeptical. Day 2. The defense fires back. When it was Marcus Bright's turn to deliver his opening statement, he took a long pause before speaking. The defense attorney, a sharp-eyed figure known for his cool-headed approach, stood tall, his dark green tie a rare splash of color in an otherwise drab courtroom. "This is not a murder trial," Bright began simply, his voice calm but filled with conviction. "This is a tragedy, a tragic loss of life, yes, but one born out of human error, not malicious intent." Bright scanned the faces of the jury, his gaze firm but not intimidating. "John Miller didn't wake up that morning planning to hurt anyone. He worked a 12-hour day in brutal heat. He came home to a messy apartment and a woman he loved but could no longer communicate with, and in a moment of frustration, a moment every human being in this courtroom is capable of experiencing, his anger boiled over. Was it reckless? Yes. Was it careless? Yes. But it was never a crime meant to kill." Bright adjusted his tie slightly, his tone softening as he continued. "Lisa Anderson loved John Miller once, just as John loved Lisa. They were flawed people stuck in an impossible situation. What happened on the night of June 14th wasn't murder, it was a terrible mistake. By the end of this trial, I believe you'll understand that." Unlike Langston, Bright's approach was less fiery but undeniably compelling. He didn't focus on guilt but rather on humanity, painting John not as a monster but as a man consumed by emotions he couldn't control. The evidence, witness testimonies. Over the next 2 weeks, the courtroom filled with a parade of witnesses and an avalanche of forensic evidence. Each day seemed to tilt the scales of justice slightly in one direction and then the other. Several neighbors testified for the prosecution, recounting the loud arguments they'd heard through the paper-thin walls of the apartment. Mrs. Patel, the elderly tenant in 3D, described hearing violent yelling the night of the fire. "I heard him shouting about cheating," she said, dabbing her forehead with a handkerchief. "Then the crashing, like something breaking. It scared me." Maggie Lopez, the lead forensic technician, took the stand and meticulously explained the burn pattern evidence. "The fire started on the rug near the wine spill. Based on our analysis, the lighter was used to ignite the area. The flames spread quickly due to the alcohol soaking into the fibers." Langston pressed. "And to be clear, Miss Lopez, was this fire an accident?" "No," Maggie affirmed with a steady voice. "There's clear evidence that flammable liquid was deliberately poured. This fire was set intentionally." Dr. Chang's autopsy report also proved damning. Lisa Anderson had a blood alcohol level of 0.18%. She was likely unconscious or incapacitated before the fire trapped her. Smoke inhalation was the primary cause of death. The jury scribbled furiously on their notepads as these scientific testimonies piled up, creating an image of a chaotic, uncontrolled inferno. John Miller takes the stand. On the 3rd week of the trial, Marcus Bright made the bold decision to put John Miller on the stand. It was a risky move, one that would either humanize John to the jury or seal his fate. Dressed in a simple navy blue suit that hung a little too loosely on his frame, John looked more like a broken man than a criminal. When Bright asked him to recall the events of that night, his voice cracked within the first few sentences. I didn't mean for any of this to happen," John stammered, his hands shaking as he gripped the edges of the witness stand. "Lisa and I, We were fighting a lot. I was angry, yes, I said things I regret, but I swear to God I didn't want to hurt her. I just wanted her to understand. Langston's cross-examination was merciless. "Mr. Miller," she began, her voice razor-sharp, "you say you didn't mean to hurt Lisa, but you threw a lit lighter onto a rug soaked with alcohol. Tell me, what exactly did you think would happen?" John's mouth opened, but no words came out. His lips trembled as he struggled to find an explanation that didn't sound utterly damning. "I wasn't thinking," he admitted finally, tears streaking down his face. I wasn't thinking." Langston pounced. "Exactly, Mr. Miller. You weren't thinking. And because of that, Lisa Anderson is dead." The verdict. After 4 weeks of gut-wrenching testimony, emotional breakdowns, and fiery legal arguments, the jury finally delivered their verdict. The entire courtroom tensed as the foreman stood, his face stoic as he unfolded the small piece of paper in his hands. "On the charge of second-degree murder," the foreman began, his voice echoing across the silent room, "we find the defendant, John Miller, not guilty." A sharp gasp rippled through the gallery, followed by hushed murmurs. Langston's jaw tightened, but she remained composed. The foreman continued. "On the charge of involuntary manslaughter, we find the defendant guilty." John's shoulders sagged as the weight of the decision hit him. He closed his eyes, silent tears streaming down his face. The judge handed down the sentence immediately, 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15. Epilogue. The weight of judgment. As John was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, he cast one final hollow glance toward Lisa's family, sitting in the front row of the gallery. Her sister, cold and unmoving, stared back at him with eyes that burned with fury and loss. No words were exchanged, but the message was clear: no sentence would ever bring Lisa back. For John, the trial had ended, but the punishment, the memories, the guilt, the sleepless nights haunted by Lisa's laughter, was only just beginning. Conclusion and lessons. The weight of the tragedy that unfolded in Apartment 3C reverberated far beyond the smoldering ashes and the courtroom walls. It wasn't just a personal catastrophe for John Miller or Lisa Anderson. It became a cautionary tale, a somber reflection on the fragility of human relationships and the destructive power of unchecked emotions. For everyone following the case, the story of John and Lisa wasn't just about a fire. It was about how love, when neglected, can twist into resentment, and how unconscious choices made in anger can forever alter lives. As the dust settled, the question that lingered in the minds of many was this: how did it all get this far? Was it inevitable the way their marriage unraveled under the weight of silence and bitterness? Or could they have saved themselves, saved Lisa's life, if they had sought help sooner, if they'd chosen to confront their differences with patience and compassion rather than anger and avoidance? The truth is, human relationships are messy, fragile, and often fraught with misunderstandings. The story of John and Lisa forces us to ask hard questions about ourselves. How do we handle conflict? Who do we turn into when we feel unappreciated, invisible, or angry? And what responsibilities do we owe to one another, even in the moments when love feels weakest? The ripple effect. For John Miller, the consequences of that fateful night were both immediate and eternal. Behind the cold steel bars of his prison cell, he now had a lifetime to reflect on his mistakes. Every clanging noise of the cell doors closing echoed as a reminder of all that he had lost: his freedom, his marriage, and above all, Lisa. For a man who once prided himself on his work ethic and his ability to shoulder burdens for those he loved, those losses created a burden he could never entirely lift. But John wasn't the only one affected. Lisa's family, especially her sister Melissa, was left permanently fractured. Melissa, who had always blamed John for Lisa's unhappiness, carried a weight of hatred and grief that she struggled to overcome. Lisa was supposed to be a cherished aunt to her children, a sister to share holidays and secrets, a lifelong companion, and in a single, preventable moment, she was gone. No conviction, no sentence, could fill the void or heal the wounds that Lisa left behind. For the neighbors and friends who once saw John and Lisa as just another ordinary married couple, their story became a grim reminder that relationships often hide dark, stormy complexities behind seemingly serene facades. It shocked a tightly woven Queens community to confront the fact that domestic struggles, if left unaddressed, could spiral into irreversible devastation. The lessons we take away. The tragedy of John and Lisa isn't just their own, it serves as a stark warning, a difficult lesson for anyone caught in the turbulence of a failing relationship. In America, where personal responsibility and individual freedom are highly valued, it's often easy to retreat into oneself when things fall apart. But this story shows us why it's so important not to let silence and frustration become the default. 1. Learn to recognize warning signs early. The distance between John and Lisa didn't happen overnight. It grew slowly, over time, in moments when they chose to let frustrations fester instead of addressing them. Every fight that ended in silence, every lingering resentment added another invisible layer of separation until they were strangers. For anyone in a relationship, John and Lisa's story is a harsh reminder to address conflict early, before it festers into something unmanageable. 2. Seek help. There's a deep stigma in asking for help, especially in relationships. John believed that long hours and financial security could resolve their unspoken tensions. Lisa thought her occasional escapism, her nights out, could fill the void left by their growing distance. Neither sought therapy, counseling, or even a meaningful conversation to bridge the gap. Their avoidance became the fuel for the fire, both figuratively and literally. Asking for help isn't weakness, it's a step towards saving relationships that feel broken. 3. Control emotions before emotions control you. John's inability to manage his anger on the night of the fire destroyed everything he once held dear. In that moment of rage, fueled by exhaustion, jealousy, and frustration, he made a split-second decision to grab a lighter and ignite the chaos. What he thought was just an outburst spiraled into a tragedy he could never undo. This is a painful but necessary lesson for us all. Our choices, especially in moments of anger, can have lasting, irreversible consequences. Sometimes all it takes is one reckless act to destroy the things we cherish most. 4. Value communication over pride. Lisa's silence, paired with John's inability to open up in meaningful ways, drove the wedge between them deeper. Instead of addressing their problems together, they lived parallel lives, each justifying their behavior by blaming the other. This focus on being right, instead of finding resolution, reflects a common issue in many relationships. Their story teaches us to leave our pride at the door and focus on honest communication. Relationships aren't about winning, they're about understanding, a reflection on human nature. The trial may have concluded, but the echoes of this tragedy remain, carrying with them difficult questions about the human condition. What drives people to lash out against those they love most? Why do we so often wait until it's too late to try to repair what's broken? And what happens to the people left behind? To the friends, family, and communities who carry the grief and burden of a life lost unnecessarily? John Miller wasn't a cold-blooded killer. Lisa Anderson wasn't a perfect victim. They were flawed people like all of us, caught in a maelstrom of their own making. But in their imperfections lies the most important lesson. Their story demands that we reflect on how we approach love, anger, and forgiveness. Not just with others, but with ourselves. Love requires work. It requires humility, effort, and a willingness to face the uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our partners. When we neglect that work, when we let resentment and frustration take the wheel, we risk steering directly into destruction. Anger, left unchecked, is like a fire. It starts small, seemingly harmless, but consumes everything in its path, if not extinguished. Final words. As John serves his sentence behind bars, he's left to grapple with the knowledge that he alone holds the blame for that night. His love for Lisa, however genuine, was overshadowed by his inability to control his emotions. And for Lisa, her memory now exists in two parts: the vibrant, magnetic woman her loved ones remember, and the tragic victim of a spiral of anger and despair. The legacy of John and Lisa's doomed relationship lives on as a stark and painful cautionary tale. In a world where passion can quickly turn to blame and love to destruction, their story challenges all of us to handle our relationships with greater care, patience, and empathy. Because sometimes the smallest choices, a word left unsaid, a wound left unhealed, can have the most catastrophic consequences. And so their story is more than just a tragedy. It's a mirror. It forces us to confront our own capacity for silence, resentment, and anger, and perhaps encourages us to choose differently before it's too late. The meaning of the story. The story conveys a message about the importance of valuing relationships, resolving conflict,